Well, thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me. Thank you for Mexa for inviting me. I'm going to speak rather quickly and go through rather a large number of issues, and we've only got half an hour. I've got a big clock over there and I'm watching it carefully. I will speak just exactly for half an hour. I'm going to say to you first that I began writing this paper by thinking through some of the key theoretical arguments that had influenced me when I was a student, and then how those might relate to contemporary problems and crises. So I'll look first at these and then consider how we, as communications specialists, might contribute in some practical ways to producing progressive outcomes. There are 5 areas of theoretical argument which I found important and have since. The first, when I was an undergraduate student, I encountered the work of Sheila Rowbottom in her study Hidden from History, where she showed how the role of women in whole areas of social life had been effectively written out by a dominant historical narrative. And this raised for me, many issues, but one of them was how the control of information could shape our understanding. And that became to me a very important theme in the development of the media work that I did in the development of the media group. The second group of argument, or the second argument which I encountered, which I thought was very important, was in the work of Howard Becker. And he posed for me the issue that if the powerful have the capacity to define what is taken as reality, that control over such key aspects of information, then, as he put it, whose side are we on if we analyze those definitions? If we as researchers question them, then we are questioning social power. The third argument which influenced me was in the work of Herbert Marcuse. And he raised for me the issue not just of how our understanding was affected, but how the most basic human values were shaped and formed within this system of dominance. He pointed to the fostering of values of individualism and materialism, and how these involved a definition of human need, which actually damaged humanity. What he saw as a false and damaging definition of needs. And his work now reads remarkably, it's written in 1969, but it seems to me remarkably relevant. He spoke of the need for possessing, consuming, handling, and constantly renewing gadgets, devices, instruments, engines that are offered to and imposed upon the people, and for using these words, even at these wares, even at the danger of one's own destruction. We might now add, even at the danger of the life on Earth, as we now face that problem. He also spoke of self-determination, of how the promotion of self-determination, the autonomy of the individual, how this asserts itself in the right to race an automobile, to handle power tools, to buy a gun, to communicate to mass audiences opinion, no matter how ignorant and aggressive it may be. And of course, the key right was the right to make profit, to expand material interests, even at the possible damage to public good. And I should say that many other theorists also pointed to how such values and dominant narratives are located in a free market capitalist society. Many people had written of this and subsequently. And their argument was that the values of a free market capitalist society put priorities of exchange and profit before human need. As Chomsky expressed it, for example, in his book, Profit Before People. Now, the fifth argument was that the powerful in such a society could use their control over economic resources and their access to other structures, such as political and media institutions, to sustain a free market system of accumulation. And by that system, in practice, the rich of the world became richer. Now, the result of that, as we've seen since then, and obviously before, was that internationally and at national level, we now encounter extraordinary levels of inequality and the concentration of economic power, resources, and wealth. In the UK, as a simple example, the bottom 50% of the population now own only 9% of the wealth. And in fact, if you look at the bottom 10%, they have actually what is called negative assets. In other words, their debts outweigh their assets. Now, if we think of these arguments in relation to some of the contemporary crises which we now face, I mean, the first, most obvious one will be the cost of living crisis. And that's very obviously related to levels of inequality. An increase in energy costs that we've just seen very quickly threatened to increase the number of people living in fuel poverty and indeed in absolute poverty. Another example would be the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed the contradiction between prioritizing the economy or focusing on public health. In my view, we're still only part of the way through that pandemic. Since what has been called Freedom Day, 37,000 people have died from COVID. I mean, died from it, not with it, simply with it. There were 2 million people with long COVID. And we now face a very real threat to the health service. There are many clinicians who are now arguing that the health service is facing a potential collapse this coming winter. But we have a government and conservative media which suggests that the pandemic is in effect all over, bar the vaccinations. That we have in effect now to live with this avoidable disease. And one of the things that I noted in looking at public discourse on this and media coverage of it was that countries which did put public health first, very clearly first, for example, New Zealand or China, were often derided and attacked, and still are, for policies which put public health before the economy or which prioritize public health. But if you look at the case of China, for example, if China had adopted our approach to COVID and it had death rates that were the same as ours, then between 3 and 4 million people would have died in China. The actual figure is around 5,000. It's also the case that if you look at what the Chinese people apparently think of this, that the policy seems to attract very great support, that the Edelman Trust barometer of support of trust in government, which is designed to look at how popular opinion focuses and trusts its own government structures and policies, that Edelman barometer has this year a 94% a trust rating, approval, which is effectively an approval rating. 94% for China. I mean, the comparative figure for Britain at the time was about 27%. Now, that figure, which is actually not generated by China, it's generated by the Edelman Trust. I mean, a figure like that and the number of deaths that were avoided in China is not part of public discourse. It's simply not featured in this country. And you can see how the structuring of information is incredibly important in terms of public understanding. If we look further into the current problems of our society, the problems of COVID really pale before those of climate breakdown. Climate breakdown seems to me to be an absolutely existential threat. As Professor Bill McGuire put it recently, humanity is smashing through the guardrails of dangerous climate change on a suicidal joyride. A particular interest for us as communication specialists is in how the public debate on this has been affected historically by corporate and state interests. There's been a lot written about this, but there was an excellent BBC programme, which you might have seen. It was a BBC film, three-part film, entitled Big Oil Against the World. And one of the things it featured was in the construction of public debate. And it gave details of a meeting which took place in 1992 between a major PR firm and a coalition of coal, oil, and other corporate interests. And the concern of these groups was to influence the narrative on climate change. So a plan was devised. And as the BBC account puts it, while most climate scientists agreed that human-caused climate change was a real issue that would require action, a small group argued that there was no cause for alarm. The plan was to pay these skeptics to give speeches or write op-eds about $1,500 per article and to arrange media tours. The important point of this for us really was spelt out by the top PR executive who was promoting this. And as he said, scientists, economists, academics, and other noted experts carry greater credibility with the media and general public than industry representatives. So it was a crucial part of the plan to organize and effect public debate, to target scientists, economists, academics, and other experts. Well, the point I will raise with you now is we are the academics. So what should be our response? How do we respond to such initiatives and to their effect upon public debate? I'll suggest some possibilities. The first is in our teaching, that we teach our students to be critical. We teach them to use the techniques of social science, to use processes of logic and comparative analysis to evaluate public discourse. We teach them to identify distorted arguments, to distinguish the good conspiracy theories from the bad ones. Then to use that understanding in practical interventions, writing, intervening, writing letters, phoning, to intervene in the media in public debate. I actually ran, as part of my teaching when I was in Glasgow, I ran exercises like this, which I would run over a week as part of my course in media and communications. And what I would do was to buy all of the newspapers, and the whole of my class, all of the students would come in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they would read all of the newspapers for that day. And then they would discuss the arguments, what was right, what was wrong. And the idea was to use what they had learned in the techniques of social science to critique the narratives in the papers. And they would then write letters, they would then go on to television, they would take part in phone-in programs, some of them actually got onto television programs. And over this week, they would contest and take on these arguments. And they would write letters. The letters were actually great. They're rather old-fashioned way of doing it. They would send emails into newspapers, but not actual letters. They would write emails in, but that was important because partly they were then subject to processes of editorial control by the papers, which they had to identify and try to work around. And they had also to think and structure the arguments. And they did incredibly well with these letters. They wrote a lot and they published a lot. It was astonishing. One day, one edition, a single edition of the Daily Mail had 4 letters in from these students. They were very, very successful. I mean, they worked out very well how to get this material across. I mean, they would write, I remember one student writing to the Daily Express and saying, "I am an enthusiastic young Daily Express reader," he said, "but I cannot help but wonder if the real scroungers in our society are the bankers and the oil magnates and not the people living on Social Security." And that was actually, I think, as I recall, was published. I mean, probably the reason was that the Daily Express has only got about 2 young readers anyway, so they were delighted to hear, you know, from one of them. But I jest. But the point is that it was extremely successful, and it's a great way of engaging and teaching and training. And that's the next thing that I'm going to say, that we should use our skills to train others. That I've worked with numbers of different groups. I mean, teaching people how to form rebuttal units, how to engage in media analysis. I've worked on media training. That there are skills in communication that we can impart and we can help with. That it's incredibly important to use our communication skills for good purposes. I think the next thing I want to say to you is that we should write critically ourselves. That in our work, we should critique the dominant narratives, that we have to examine the way in which false narratives are created and promoted. We must hold broadcasters and other media to account on criteria of accuracy and balance. We have to show in our work what's been left out of the dominant narratives. And in doing so, we confront powerful interests with information which they would prefer was suppressed. Much of the work of the Glasgow Media Group did exactly that and covered a whole range of very difficult, contested, controversial areas and showed what was missing from public debate on a very wide range of areas. What I've found in doing that was the extraordinary pressures that could be put upon academics and journalists when they tried to do that, when they tried to challenge dominant narratives. And I found that in many areas, but one of them was when I wrote about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I found that in particular, really, people who wrote critically about Israel were subject to all sorts of pressures. And I found that with journalists who when I interviewed them, were very clear about the pressures that they were under. And in one book one of the books, I wrote several on the Israel-Palestine issue, but one was More Bad News from Israel. I detailed the pressures that affected journalists, also as they explained them to me. I remember John Pilger speaking with me and saying that when he had made the program Palestine is Still the Issue, how there'd been extraordinary criticism of him, that he said there were literally thousands of emails and pieces of correspondence sent to the broadcasting authorities. And because of the sheer quantity, he had then to take time off work, for 6 weeks off work, in order to answer, because the authorities had ordered an inquiry into the program. He had to hire a special research assistant, and they had to go through this enormous volume of correspondence. And he was able to show that the bulk of it had in fact come from America, where the program had not actually been shown. And in the end, the program was cleared. But that has an incredibly chilling effect, or potentially has a very chilling effect. And it is the case that some journalists I spoke to said to me that their working assumption was that if they criticized Israel, potentially the roof would fall in, but that didn't apply to criticism really of Palestinians. And of course, one of the effects that we showed in our book was the consequences of that is that journalists tend to simply avoid the most contested or difficult or potentially dangerous areas to speak about. We must contest that. We have to resist that sort of pressure. We have to stand by the criteria of social science, the criteria of accuracy, the criteria of good critical commentary. And we have to resist pressures on us, not only that area, but in all of the areas of our work. I want to say to you finally that as academics, we should engage ourselves in public discourse. We have to write, we have to speak, we have to challenge, and we have to demand change. We have a duty of care to our students and to the society in which we live. We should, in the end, be on the side of humanity and of its survival. I can't think of a more existential issue than the survival of humanity and the threat that we now face from climate breakdown. By some measures, the consequences of climate change, of the consequences and what will happen, by some measures, the planet will support only half of its population. It's simply impossible to get your head around what that means. We see the media of this country panicking about 20,000 refugees. Just imagine if enormous numbers of people can no longer survive where they live. What that signifies in terms, literally, of the collapse of civilization. What I'm saying to you is that it is midnight. It's not 5 minutes to. We are at an absolutely crucial moment. We, as academics, as speakers, as influencers of opinion, we have to take part in this. We have to help the progressive forces of our society to avert the really terrible consequences that lie ahead if this climate breakdown is allowed to continue. Okay, that's all I've got to say. We can take questions now.